All right, everybody.
Excellent. So at this point, maybe everybody should mute themselves and so forth.
Yeah, except for me, but
Except for
there you go. All right. Jim McGlone is our speaker this evening, everybody, and I'm sure you'll really enjoy his presentation. And let me read you his bio. He has a PhD in human ecology, aka economics, from Virginia Tech, and a master's certificate in environmental law and policy from the USDA Graduate School. He has taught economics at Virginia Tech, Ohio State, and Northern Illinois University, and done research at the Economic Research Service of the USDA. A self-taught naturalist and ecologist, he has managed the natural resources of a 500-acre park in Fairfax County and is currently an urban forest conservationist with the Virginia Department of Forestry in Northern Virginia. He is an ISA certified arborist and has the ISA tree risk assessment qualification. Take it away, Jim.
Thank you. That's my
Jim?
old bio because I have retired from the Department of
I
Forestry.
hope so. I was like, wait a second,
Yeah.
you retired. What is up with that, man?
So that's okay. Retiring didn't cause me to, I didn't have to leave behind anything I knew or any of the presentations or work that I had done while I was at the Department of Forestry. So
Jim,
tonight we are going to talk about
Jim?
tree anatomy and physiology.
Jim,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Can I just interject one quick thing for the class?
Sure.
You were on the team that helped revise the 2020 tree manual that we're using as a textbook. And
Yes.
so his name is on page 2 under the acknowledgments. So
Yes, and I just finished compiling a first draft of an answer key for the TreeSteward manual. And there are some things that are going to change in that manual that are actually factually wrong. But I'm working on that with Molly and Laura down at Charlottesville. So tonight we're going to talk about tree anatomy and physiology. This is units 1 and 2 of your manual. And then we're going to jump ahead towards the end to unit 7, which is about pruning. I have actually had 2 presentations. I do tree anatomy and physiology sort of separately, and then I've got another presentation where I further adapt this. When we get to the changeover, we'll take about a 5-minute break so you can get up and get some circulation, get some coffee going.
Jim, do you want people to put the questions in the chat and we'll
Yes, if you could do that and monitor that. I will stop periodically and ask for questions.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
So, if you're going to be a tree steward, and if we're going to talk about trees, I think we need to answer the question, what is a tree? This seems like a simple question, but it's actually a little bit complicated. And part of that is because of the evolution of trees, which actually, or the evolution of plants, which actually follows the way the Linnaean system goes about sorting through all of these things we call plants and putting them into their respective genre and species. So in the evolution of plants, the first things that came out of the sea, the first terrestrial plants, were non-vascular spore-bearing plants. These are things like mosses, which we still see today. And when we are doing taxonomy, the first question we ask is it a vascular plant? Is it a non-vascular plant? So that separates out the mosses. The next big innovation in plants after developing vascular tissue was developing seeds. So here we still have vascular plants that are spore bearing. Around here, we have ferns and horsetails. In some parts of the world, they still have tree ferns. Seed bearing first started with what we call gymnosperms, which have naked seeds, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. And we still have gymnosperms around, and they are pretty important in our landscapes in the form of conifers and ginkgos. After the introduction of seeds came the introduction of flowers. These are the angiosperms, or covered seed plants. And what that means is the seed develops inside a compartment in the flower called an ovary. This is the difference between the angiosperms and the gymnosperms. Is angiosperms produce flowers that have ovaries that enclose the egg cells, the ova. And then as those seeds, once those ova are fertilized and the seeds start to develop, the ovaries start to expand and become modified, but they continue to cover the seed in what we call fruit. Some of you are probably going, okay, fruit, you're thinking the stuff you buy at the grocery store, peaches and cherries and melons. And even if you're really sophisticated, you recognize the tomatoes and beans and things like that have seeds in them are fruits. But a fruit can also be a very dry structure, like the helicopter that envelops and covers the seeds of the maple. And so that's the difference between the angiosperms and the gymnosperms. They produce flowers. They have these ovaries that cover the seeds and the egg cells, whereas that's the angiosperms. The gymnosperms don't do that. And then the angiosperms are divided into the monocots and the dicots. Cot is short for cotyledon, which is the embryonic leaf inside the seed. Monocots have a single leaf. Dicots have two leaves. So monocots that some people consider to be are trees would be palms, and another woody monocot is bamboo. The dicots, which is most of the trees we have around here, are things like oaks and maples, the broadleaf trees that basically that are native to and usually grown in this area are not conifers or ginkgos. The problem, though, is that throughout this process of evolution, tree form has evolved in every one of these lineages. I mentioned there are still tree ferns. Back before we had seed-bearing plants, we had lots of tree ferns and trees that were essentially horsetails, or very similar to today's horsetails. Those are still important because that's what made the coal beds that we use to drive the Industrial Revolution. But the gymnosperms and the angiosperms have independently evolved tree forms. Some of the best evidence, I think, of this, or the place you can look for it, is in the rose family, Rosacea, or the pea family, Fabaceae, because in the rose family, you have plants that are native to this area, like black cherry, which is definitely a tree. But also native to this area is a rose family plant called the wild strawberry, which is definitely not a tree or even a woody plant. So we do see this coming up again and again. And it makes it difficult because we can't just point to say, okay, trees are dicots. There are some dicots that are trees, but there are a lot that aren't. And we also have gymnosperms that are trees. So in the book, they define a tree as something that can be 15 feet tall and usually has a single trunk and is self-supporting. This is one definition that people use. The 15 feet tall, I've seen definitions that go to 20, 25 feet, or even some down to 12 feet. In a book by Sibley, which is a very good, if you know what tree you're looking at, is a very good book. It's not all that great if you're trying to figure out what the tree is, because it doesn't really have a key in it. But Sibley says that you walk under a tree and you walk around a shrub. What I'm going to tell you is we have woody plants and herbaceous plants. And woody plants, whether you call them a tree, a shrub, or a woody vine, all have basically the same kind of anatomy and physiology. There are some differences in their structure because of their size or whether or not they are self-supporting. But the way they grow, the way they live, is all pretty much the same. So we will be talking about trees, but keep in mind that a lot of what we're saying also applies to shrubs and to woody vines. All right. Any questions about what a tree is? Probably didn't think you could spend 10 minutes talking about what a tree is. I got to speed up here. Okay. So the structure of a tree, I know you talked a little bit about this before the rain, but this is what a tree aspires to. It has basically two systems. It's got the shoot system, which is the part above ground, and it's got the root system, which is the part below ground. And except for palms, they have dendritic structure. That is, you start with a big piece and it starts splitting off smaller and smaller pieces until you get out to the small structures at the ends of the branches or the tips of the roots. The other thing to keep in mind is the root system and the shoot system have approximately the same mass. So think about taking a ball of pizza dough and making it into a crust. The ball would be the shoot system, the crust would be the root system. The other thing to notice in this picture is most of those roots are in the top of the soil column. Generally, within the top 18 inches, you're going to find at least 80% of the root system. That's because in addition to supporting the tree, roots are collecting water, they're collecting nutrients, and they have living cells that have to conduct cellular respiration, which means they need oxygen. And they're going to find the water, the nutrients and the oxygen that they need in that top part of the soil column. A tree can actually pull water up from as much as 4 feet deep through processes that draw water up through the soil column that you'll talk about later when you get to the unit on soils. When we look at these two systems, they are similar. The root system and the branches both have small structures that support the energy system of the tree. In the root system, we call these the absorbing roots. These are the roots that are the primary water collectors. And with water comes nutrients, which are dissolved in the water. In the branch system, we call these structures leaves. This is where photosynthesis takes place. So the leaves are collecting light and carbon dioxide, and together with the water that's collected in the root system, they conduct photosynthesis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Then there are the conductive roots. These are larger roots that range from about 1/16 of an inch up to 2 inches in diameter. And they are the ones that support those absorbing roots and connect them to the rest of the tree. In the shoot system, we call those twigs or branches. These are the larger stems, the twigs that support the leaves, and then the larger stems that support the twigs. The conductive roots and the branches attach to even larger structures. In the root system, these are the buttress roots. These are anywhere from 2 inches to, in some cases, 8, 10, 12 inches in diameter. And their primary function is actually to support the tree. So these are generally around the base of the tree, almost like the foot of a wine glass supports the wine glass. These buttress roots support the weight of the tree and connect the root system to the trunk. Above ground, the scaffold branches. These are the large branches that support the branches and twigs that carry the leaves. And these are the very large branches that connect the crown to the trunk. This is where a lot of the weight of the crown is held, is in these scaffold branches and translated into the trunk. And then the trunk is the connection between the branch system and the shoot system and the root system. Within the tree, you will find various types of tissues that do different things. This is one of the advantages of the vascular system, is now you can have differentiation of tissues. The meristems are found in the tree, and these are the living cells that are capable of making new cells. They can divide and form new cells. And those cells can also differentiate into the other tissues of the tree as needed. So this is where growth takes place in the tree, is in the meristems. The vascular tissue, sometimes called xylem and phloem, is what conducts, the xylem conducts water and nutrients from the roots to the crown, and the phloem is translocating, that is, it's moving photosynthate, which is a big word for sugars that come from photosynthesis. The third type of tissue is ground, and this is kind of a catch-all. Everything that is not meristem or vascular is ground. This would include the fibers that we find in the stems and the seeds that give structure to those parts of the plant. The parenchyma, which is very important, and I just discovered is not in your text, but will be. It does lots of things. It's parenchyma in the leaves that conducts where photosynthesis is conducted. Parenchyma is where sugar is converted to starch for storage, or starch is converted to sugar mainly to support leaf out. The parenchyma also produces what we call secondary chemicals. These are plant hormones and biocides that the tree uses to defend itself. In some cases, they're producing volatile organic compounds in the leaves and the stems that get released so different parts of the tree can talk to each other, or so trees can talk between themselves. The parenchyma cells are living cells, but they are non-reproductive. That is, they cannot divide and make new cells. Parenchyma is made by the meristem, but once it's laid down as parenchyma, it can't make new cells. And finally, there's the epidermal tissue. This is the outermost skin. It has two big functions. It controls gas and water exchange. So stomata that we'll mention later and lenticels are where gas exchange occurs. Water exchange occurs across the epidermis in the root system to allow water to come in. But above ground, the epidermis prevents water exchange, so it keeps moisture in the tree. So these are taken together, depending on whether you want to use ground and combine all those things or not, the 3 or 5 different types of tissues you'll find in the tree. If we look at a cross section of the tree, we can see all of those different tissues. So this dark spot line here is where the meristem or the cambium was. So this is where those living cells were that could divide and make the new wood of the tree, as well as make the phloem, which is just outside of it, and the bark. Inside of the cambium, we have wood. One of the confusing things is that sometimes we use xylem to refer to vascular tissue, and sometimes we use it to refer to the wood. Xylem is actually the Greek word for wood. Within the xylem, we have these vessel elements. These are these large pore spaces, and this is where the water, or most of the water, actually is transferred through the xylem, is in these vessel elements. In conifers, we call them tracheids. So the other part of the wood is fiber. This darker brown stuff is all fiber. This is what helps support the tree and give it its strength. And then this cream colored areas is parenchyma. And notice there are these long, thick lines. These are called parenchymal rays, and they connect all the way to the phloem. So this is how sugar gets into, because remember, parenchyma are living cells and they need the sugar in order to live. And notice there are all these little chains of parenchymal cells that connect up to these rays, as well as parenchyma surrounding these vessel elements that help them do their job of raising water from the roots up to the canopy of the tree. Twigs do have some special anatomy that's important. One thing are called the nodes. So there's a node here, 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 here. This is where there are lateral buds attached to the tree. Sometimes these are leaf buds, and they will, in the axils or in the crotch between the twig and the petiole, which is part of the leaf blade, there will be what we call axillary buds, and those could eventually become shoots. This node and this node are what we call the terminal bud scars. So this is where growth ended and a terminal bud was formed on this twig last year. This is where the growth, well, actually it's 2 years ago. This is where the growth ended last year. And we talk about the internodal, or the space between these, as showing how much growth occurred over the current year in the tree. If these are long, the tree is usually happy and healthy. If they are short, it can mean the tree is diseased. Another thing that's important, especially as we get into the winter and you start trying to learn winter tree ID, are the bud scars. This is where a leaf attached to the twig and it left behind this scar. And these things are unique to the species. So if you know your bud scars, you can identify a tree simply by looking at the shape and the placement of the axial bud within the bud scar. So it looks like we may have one question in the chat before we move on to physiology.
Yeah, someone was asking if you could
Sapwood and heartwood. We will get to that later on. Okay? When we start talking about tree growth. I will cover that,
Okay.
so just hang on. All right. Tree physiology. This is basically how the tree lives, and in particular, it's the energy system of the tree. So a very basic outline. Plants create biochemical energy in the form of sugar bonds through the process of photosynthesis. Then sugar, water, and nutrients are moved around the plant through the vascular system, and they wind up in living cells. And those living cells then burn the sugar in the presence of oxygen in a process called cellular respiration. If you've had college biology, you might remember talking about the Krebs cycle. And this process energizes molecules called ATP. This is essentially the cellular energy that then can fuel the production of proteins and enzymes and fats and all the different things that the cell needs for cellular repair, for defense, for plant hormones, and if it's the meristem that's doing this, new tissues this is where the energy to drive cell division comes from. So photosynthesis is taking place in the parenchyma, in the leaves, and some of the new shoots that are green. Respiration takes place in the parenchyma and the meristem, because these are the two primary living cells in the the tree that do this, and they need the energy to continue their lifespan. And when we take photosynthesis and respiration together, essentially what we're looking at is a process that turns solar energy into cellular energy that then drives the cellular functions. So if we look at these separately, the general equation for photosynthesis is 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water yields a sugar molecule. This is glucose plus oxygen molecules. The carbon dioxide comes from the air through the stomata. So these are little openings, and they have guard cells on them. These things work like those springy change purses, where when you squeeze it, they open, and when you release it, they close shut. Same thing, the stomata work pretty much the same way, and they can let in carbon dioxide and they can let out oxygen and water vapor. And the water that is needed for photosynthesis comes up from the root system through the xylem. And the output then is sugars. In cellular respiration, if you notice, the chemical equation is pretty much the reverse, where you take a sugar molecule and 6 oxygen molecules, and in the process of respiration, convert them to 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water molecules, and then 3 energized ATPs. And in this case, we're getting sugar from the leaves or from storage, oxygen from the lenticels, and most of the lenticels are in the root system. Remember, I said the roots need oxygen. And we're also getting nutrients from the root system. And so cellular respiration is converting the latent energy in the sugar into useful cellular energy, so that, if I recall my biology correctly, the ribosomes can then take the direction from the DNA and use nutrients to build all of the new molecules that they need for new tissues, or to produce toxins or hormones, or to maintain the cell. So we can look at that graphically in this way. This is a tree energy model. So you have the root system down here, you have the leaves up here, and you've got sunlight and carbon dioxide and water coming into the leaf to do photosynthesis, which creates the sugars, which either go into storage or they go into the living cells. And nutrients and oxygen go into those living cells along with the sugar to perform these cell functions and build new tissues, or maintain the existing tissues, or create toxins. One of the places where a lot of maintenance takes place is in the chloroplast, because chlorophyll is a very delicate molecule and is in constant need of repair. So this model you will see again when I come back and talk about tree diagnostics, because understanding this model and where all these things are, you can look at what's going on in the tree and figure out where it's breaking down. In particular, when you start to see dieback, the question is water getting to the crown of the tree? In which case the problem is in the crown, or is it not? And that's governed by whether or not you have shoots. But we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when you see me again. Another thing the tree does with its sugar is create exudate. This is essentially if you know what exudate means, this is where sugars are being expelled from the plant, mostly in the soil, but it happens throughout the plant. And the purpose of this is to attract beneficial microbes for defense. So this can be bacteria or it can be fungi. And I say beneficial, but it could be non-pathogenic, because sometimes all they're looking for are bacteria and fungi to cover the outer layer of the tree, the epidermis, and create an additional barrier for pathogens. But many of them are beneficial because there's a lot of warfare that goes on among these, particularly the soil microbes. In fact, that's where we get our antibiotics. One particular class of microbes that the tree wants to attract are what we call mycorrhizal fungi. These combine with the root system and create a symbiotic structure we call mycorrhizae. And this is a mutualism because the fungus benefits by getting sugar from the tree benefits by getting water and nutrients from the fungus. And we'll see that later on. Most of these things are not specialized. The ones that are specialized, and the only group that I know of that are at all specialized, are the ericoid mycorrhizae, and they specialize on the family Ericaceae. That is a large family. It includes hundreds of genera and tens of thousands of species. One of the genuses or genre in the family is rhododendron, which has over 1,000 species worldwide. And these ericoid mycorrhizae will work with any of the plants in that family. For trees, a certain type of mycorrhizae called ectomycorrhizae, which makes up about 20% of all the mycorrhizal species, are what they prefer to work with. The other thing is, if you go to the nursery, or you will find packets of mycorrhizal inoculant. There is good science that says these things help with plant growth. But all of that science was conducted in the laboratory. Every time they try and take it out of the laboratory, it fails. And that's because the spores of these mycorrhizal fungi are everywhere. So using this on an outdoor plant is like taking a bucket of sand to the beach. It just doesn't make any difference. So save your money. Don't buy this stuff. All right. Before we get into tree growth, I see a couple more questions. ATP. I was afraid somebody was going to ask me this. I keep forgetting what the A stands for. It's something like adrena triphosphate. I know the TP is triphosphate. It's not that important that you know what it stands for. It is a molecule that will accept, I think it's electrons from the, thank you, Linda, adenosine triphosphate. The TP is easy. The A is difficult for me, but it's just what will happen is, I believe they get electrons from the breaking down the sugar bonds, and that's what gives them the energy to run. But it's been a while since I read the biochemistry of that. The important thing there is to know that photosynthesis takes solar energy and fixes it in sugar. Cellular respiration takes energy fixed in sugars and turns it into an energy form the cell can use to conduct its functions. Okay? So let's talk about how trees grow. And remember, what I said at the beginning is that all tree growth occurs in the meristem. In the book, they use the term apical meristem and lateral meristem. I prefer primary meristem and secondary meristem, largely because we talk about lateral buds and that gets really confusing. So primary meristem is the stuff you find in buds. This is the meristem that will elongate into shoots and roots. Along the way, it produces the cortex, the epidermis. It's producing secondary meristem, and it'll produce lateral buds at nodes and axial buds in the leaf. but in some cases, it will also produce latent or suppressed buds as part of the growth. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. The other thing that we get from primary meristem are the leaves and the flowers. So all the buds that you will use to identify trees in the wintertime will eventually expand. They're full of this primary meristem that can make this new elongation, the new shoots and the new roots, or the leaves and flowers of the tree. The other type of meristem is called the secondary meristem. It's also known as the cambium. This is located right below the bark of the wood, right below the bark, between the bark and the wood of the tree, which is why you want to be careful not to damage the bark, because you can damage this very thin layer of tissue called the cambium. This is what produces the vascular tissue, the xylem that's going to persist as wood and move the water and nutrients, and the phloem, which is actually out between the cambium and the bark, which moves sugar. And in some species, the phloem becomes part of the bark. In other species, it gets reabsorbed, and the resources, the elements in it are used to build new phloem and other tissues. The secondary meristem is also going to be producing the stem parenchyma and the fibers, stem fibers that are part of the wood. So we can look at tree growth. This is a sprout from last year, and it doesn't matter whether this is a new sprout from a seed or a sprout that was grown at the top of an oak tree. Trees are modular this way, which makes it really easy to understand them and how they grow. And what will happen in the spring is, first, the primary meristem will wake up and will get shoot elongation. So you get a new shoot that may have some lateral buds, it may have some leaves or other things that grows from that terminal bud, that primary meristem that was on the shoot from last year. Then the secondary meristem will kick in, and it'll start growing a new layer of wood over last year's wood. And it starts at the tips of the branches and works its way down through the trunk. And this is important when we talk about branch attachment. So here is an example of that shoot. All of this green part, you can see that up here where my fingers are, the bark, there is bark, it's brown, but then we had this new shoot that was the expansion of the branch. This is a viburnum dentatum. And you can see as that meristem expanded and elongated into this new shoot, it also produced leaves along the way. And if you look really carefully, you can see axial buds there. They're not very obvious now, but over the course of the year, they will get bigger. You might even see these white spots that are the lenticels in it. So this is 1 year's growth, and the terminal bud scar is there. It will eventually produce a terminal bud, and there'll be a scar there, and we can look at that and go, wow, this thing really grew a lot in this year. The other part of growth is the diameter growth. So here we have a shoot or growth from last year, and the next year we'll get new layer of wood on top of last year's layer. So now we have 2 layers of xylem. They both have living parenchyma in them. They both are being used to conduct water. This is what we call sapwood. So sapwood is the part of the tree with living xylem that has living and active parenchyma. It's the part that's actively being used in the vascular system of the tree. Eventually, what will happen is we will get heartwood formation, and I'll talk about that in a moment with another slide where I've actually got a picture of the heartwood. It takes different species and different types of trees, longer or shorter, to produce heartwood. Suffice it to say, this is no longer vascular tissue. It's dead in the sense that 2x4s are dead. And it's this layering that creates the tree rings that everybody has heard about. So in this micrograph of the Quercus nigra, the water oak, which is what we call a ring porous tree, the growth starts in the spring, in the early part of the year. It lays down these great big vessel elements. That's because it's moving a lot of water through there to support the leaf out. Once the canopy is established and the leaves are hardened off, and it starts producing much smaller vessel elements. You can barely see them in these tracks through here. This is what we call late wood. So the early wood or spring wood in a ring porous tree is very obvious with these big vessel elements. The late wood is obvious by not having well-defined or easy to spot vessel elements. And this blue line is kind of the divide between the early wood and the late wood, and taken together, that is 1 year's growth. At the end of the growing season, the tree will start producing a layer of thick cells right along the edge of the wood. Those cells are part of its defensive process we'll talk about later. But that they do that to protect the tree from decay. There are also ring diffuse trees like the sugar maple. Notice the vessel elements are all about the same size. There is very little distinction between that early wood and late wood. And it's even hard to see the annual growth. You might look at this picture and think these bright lines are the annual growth rings, but those are the parenchymal rays. The annual growth rings are here, here, and here. And as I said, very indistinct. So it can be very difficult to look at a piece of wood and try and count the growth rings and figure out how old that wood is, depending on whether it is a ring porous or a ring diffuse tree. And of course, this exists on a continuum. So there are some trees that are kind of in between ring diffuse and ring porous that have some of the characteristics of both. The heartwood, which is in the center of the tree, as I said, this is dead tissue. There are no living cells in here. When the tree created this as heartwood, the parenchyma cells that were in the living sapwood, and they do this one growth ring at a time, the parenchyma creates the heartwood. What it does is it diffuses and infuses the wood with biocides. These are things that will kill wood decay organisms, things like fungicides and bactericides. They may be blowing out these tyluses, which clog up the vascular tissue, but there's no photosynthate going into the heartwood. And typically it is darker than the sapwood. So the difference between the heartwood and the sapwood is that sapwood is still being used, or is currently being used, to move water and nutrients. It's part of the vascular system of the tree. The heartwood isn't. The other thing is sapwood relies on active defenses. It relies on those living parenchyma cells to start producing defensive chemicals if it gets attacked by a wood decay organism. The heartwood relies on these static defenses that have been put in place when it was created. Another part of growth is something called reaction wood. I mentioned the secondary meristem makes the wood. It will respond to physical stress by producing additional wood fiber. So if you can see here where the kink is in this tree, the cambium in here was, or secondary meristem was under compressive stress, and that caused it to grow this ridge of wood you see to support this kink. You will also see trees should have a taper, and that taper is caused when the tree sways in the breeze. The bending and the pressure on the cambium can cause it to grow additional wood as well. The other place you might see it is if there is an internal cavity, that's going to affect the way weight is distributed or distributed around that cavity, especially in the trunk. And that can cause stress on the cambium that also causes it to react and produce additional wood. You can also get a lot of branches have a cross section that looks like this because the wood underneath is in compression. And so this cambium is responding by growing additional wood fiber. The other reason you might see this happening, especially in the trunk of the tree, is if for some reason there are more resources on this side of the tree for the cambium over there to work with, whether it's getting more water on this side or usually more light, so there's more sugar coming down this side. And so the tree can grow additional wood on that side of the tree, reflecting that. Another thing is that the tree rings do reflect what's been happening in the environment. So we can look at the tree rings, and some of them will be wide and some of them will be narrow, and that will tell us whether there have been droughty conditions or freezing conditions or various things. There's actually an entire discipline called dendrochronology, and that's all they're looking at is the tree rings and what it tells about the environment in which that tree grew. That data that's contained within the tree rings actually has been very important in our understanding of climate change and how the climate has warmed up over the past 20 or 30. If you remember Al Gore's hockey stick, a lot of the data came from dendrochronology and from tree rings around the world. So just as a review of the tree and diameter growth, you have the heartwood in the center of the tree, which is the dead xylem. It's no longer moving water. It no longer has living parenchyma cells in it. The next layer is the sapwood, which is being used to conduct water and also has living parenchyma in it. So this is living xylem. Then the cambium, then the phloem, then the outer bark. This is a picture of the stump of a white oak. And I know I said that heartwood is usually lighter or darker colored than sapwood. This picture was taken about 6 months after the tree was cut down. And remember, sapwood relies on active defenses. And when the tree is cut down, the sapwood dies and there's no defense. So the sapwood here is dark, has a dark colored, because that is fungal staining as the fungi begins to digest and eat that sapwood. You can notice there's a little bit of staining in the heartwood here, but white oak is very good at resisting decay. And then you can see the outer bark of the tree. Now, there are some exceptions to what we just talked about. Monocots have no secondary meristem. They do not get bigger around. This is why some people will tell you palms are not really trees. In fact, palms only have primary one locus, one area of primary meristem, and that's a big bud at the top of the trunk that produces the fronds and the flowers and things. They don't even have primary meristem in their root system, growing their roots. Conifers, I mentioned that one of the things the primary meristem does as shoots elongate is they produce these suppressed buds. Conifers do not have suppressed buds. This affects the way we prune conifers, as opposed to dicots, which have lots of suppressed buds. And it's what I call Plan B. And the reason they have them, or the value of those suppressed lateral buds, is that if the tree is damaged, those buds are in place to grow replacement parts for the replacements for those lost parts. So if the top of the canopy breaks out, those suppressed buds are released and they start growing new branches to replace that lost canopy. They also allow the tree to exploit new opportunities. At Conway Robinson, we've got a lot of oaks that are growing around ash trees. The ash trees have been killed by emerald ash borer, and this has created a sunny spot next to these oak trees, and they've started sprouting from their trunks. Usually, sprouting from the trunk is a sign of distress or disease. In this case, it's just that all of a sudden, those suppressed buds along the trunk now are getting a lot of sunlight, and so they're growing new branches to take advantage of that additional sunlight. We will also talk about manipulating these suppressed buds, or being aware of these suppressed buds when we prune. One last thing, I think this is, before we get to the questions. There are some messy chemical bits out there that I didn't talk about. Auxins in the buds. These are hormones that can control the growth form of the tree. The terminal bud uses these auxins to suppress those lateral buds in the dicots and affects the way the tree grows. When this is maintained better, we get next current form. We'll talk about this a little more. Where the dominance lapses, we get a decurrent form. Trees can also sense gravity and light and water using all kinds of really cool biochemistry and imbalances, and they can grow to or from those sources. So, for example, roots can sense gravity through various biochemical processes. The top of the root produces more auxin than the bottom of the root, and that causes the root to bend and start growing down. This ability to sense and grow either to or away from certain environmental cues is called a tropism. So there's gravitropism, there's phototropism, there's hydrotropism, and all that means is the plant senses these things and is either moving towards them or away from them. The other thing is that trees can sense their carbon-nitrogen ratio and use this to determine whether to put energy into growing roots or shoots or both. When the carbon-nitrogen ratio is low, that is lots of nitrogen in the soil, the tree is looking at that and saying, I've got lots of nutrients. I need more energy to process those nutrients. So it directs its growth energy towards shoots. When the opposite happens, when the carbon-nitrogen ratio is low, it's saying the plant knows it's got lots of energy and it needs more nutrients to do work with that energy, so it starts growing roots. This is why we do not give nitrogen to newly planted trees. We want them to grow roots. And if we give them nitrogen, we're telling them to grow shoots. There's also something called that, in fancy terms, is called phenotypic plasticity. This is also known as adaptability. Essentially, what the phenotype is how the tree expresses its genes in response to the environment. So a good example of that is oaks. In the forest, oaks will grow as a tree with a long, straight, branchless trunk that then supports a narrow crown. But if you take the oak out of the forest and you grow it in the open, you will get a short, many branch trunk with big, massive scaffold branches on it. I like to think about the way I describe this is in the forest, oaks become basketball centers. In the field, they become defensive linemen. And this is true for all oaks because they have a lot of phenotypic plasticity or a lot of adaptability. In this case, they are adapting to the light resources they have. On the other hand, Eastern white pine has almost no plasticity, does not adapt. It grows the same way in a field as it does in the forest. The only difference is in the forest, the lower branches get shaded off or get shaded out, and they die and they break off and leave these nasty looking stubs. But when it's open grown, it maintains the branches all the way to the ground. And it grows the same way. The root system is the same. This is why these things are not wind firm. And usually when we have wind events, a majority of the trees that get blown over are these eastern white pines. So let's see. What is the difference between hardwood and softwood trees and lumber? This is mainly, this is something that is used in the lumber trade to distinguish between angiosperms and gymnosperms. Because some angiosperms, like balsa, have very soft wood. And some gymnosperms, like Dade County pine, which is so dense it doesn't float, have very hard wood. So when we say hardwood, we mean angiosperms, and when we say softwood, they mean gymnosperms, mainly pines. But that is really more of a lumber term than a arborist or forestry term. Yes, actually, if you think back to the question is, are you saying that water oak and all the oaks, the spring growth is less thick than the fall growth? And that is the case. It's also less dense and does not have as much strength because most of the early wood in oak is pore space in those vessel elements. The strength comes from all the fiber it grows later in the year. But the early wood is less dense and weaker than the late wood. And Scott says, I thought the cambium was made up of the xylem and the phloem together. That is not correct. Actually, the cambium separates the xylem from the phloem because it makes the xylem and the phloem. So the xylem is to the inside of the tree and the phloem is to the outside of the tree. So to say the cambium is made up of them is not exactly correct because the cells in the cambium have not differentiated and become either xylem or phloem yet. So what happens is as the cambium makes new cells, some of them differentiate into xylem or phloem. Okay, you're welcome, Scott. All right, the next part is pretty short, so we may skip to, we may wait a little bit for questions, is root growth. And the reason root growth is short is because root growth and shoot growth are basically the same thing. You have a primary meristem, which is down at the tip of the root. It will divide and multiply and make cells. Some of them will stay there as primary meristem. Other cells will begin to elongate. This is one of the differences between, as I understand it, between the shoots and the roots is differentiation takes place in the bud, in the shoots. It does not take place until after the cells elongate. And then they can turn into the epidermis, which includes the root hair. This is really important because the root hairs are where a lot of the water and nutrients are entering into the cell. This is also where a lot of those mycorrhizae are forming. It can also differentiate into secondary meristem because you do get secondary growth in roots, the cortex, which is this kind of nascent vascular system that will eventually differentiate into the phloem and xylem, all of the ground tissue, the fibers and things that we talked about, as well as the primary meristem. The other thing that is being produced in the root system that you don't get in the shoot system is this thing called a root cap. This is part of the epidermis. These are thick, heavy epidermal cells that are being shed and actually acting as kind of a lubricant as the root elongates and extends through the soil. So they are growing those and shedding them, but they're also protecting that very delicate meristem at the tip of the branch. This is what root system. This is a 1-year-old red maple that was grown from seed. This is a standard 12-inch ruler. And you can see the different types of roots here. You've got these smaller, fine, these are the absorbing roots. The slightly larger roots are those connective roots. And then you can see the beginning of the buttress roots here at the base of the tree. Tree doesn't really develop much in the way of or really distinguish buttress roots until it gets bigger and it's got more weight to support. But this is the beginning of that buttress root system. There are also heart roots that grow down right at the base of the tree. One of the things to notice here is when the seed germinated, it sent down its embryonic root called a radicle, and that went down until it reached a place it didn't like, and then it stopped growing. It does not continue to grow. It's because people have looked at these seedlings and seen that radical root that they think trees have these big tap roots, and they don't. That root is only going to go down, depending on the growing, depending on where it's growing, and it may only go down a few inches to up to 12 or 18 inches on a really good site, but it's going to eventually reach a place where it's not getting enough oxygen, it's not getting enough nutrients, it's going to stop growing down, and that's when it sends a signal back up and says, start growing laterally, and you get this kind of a root system developing. So let's talk about woody plant sex. And as I was going over this couple of hours ago before the class, I realized that I didn't really talk about gymnosperm sex. That's because gymnosperm sex is pretty straightforward. In all plants, sexual reproduction occurs when a sperm cell, the male gamete, unites with an egg cell, the female gamete, and they fertilize and start to create an embryonic plant. In gymnosperms, those sperm cells, at least in conifers, those sperm cells are contained in pollen, which is created in the male cone at the tip of the plant, at the tip of the branch. The egg cells are on an exposed ovule within the female cones that are further back, that are further in the canopy. And the wind blows and the pollen lands on the female cones. It germinates, it extrudes a tube, and the sperm cell swims down the tube in search of the egg cell. And that's it. That's the way it works for all of the conifers, and it's pretty much the same for the ginkgos. In the angiosperms, the presence of the flowers, though, can make things interesting. So flowers have two parts. There's the female part. This is sometimes called the pistil, and in the pistil consists of the stigma, which is where the pollen lands, the style, which is a tube that connects the stigma to the ovary, and then there are walls around the ovary, which is called the carpel. And the egg cells are contained within the ovaries. This is the female part of the plant. The male plant consists of the stamen, which is the filament, that's the stem that supports the anther, which is the part where the pollen is made and released. In angiosperms, you can have female flowers that only have the pistil and the ovaries, or you can have male flowers that only have the stamen and the anthers, or you can have cosexual flowers which have both. And here is where things get really wild, because on a tree can be monoecious. And that means it has the male and female parts on the same plant. Now, keep in mind, that can be a cosexual flower that has both parts as part of the flower, like a tulip poplar, or it can be a plant that has the male flowers and the female flowers on the same tree, like an oak. The other thing they mention in the manual is dioecious. This would be like hollies and spicebush, where the male and the female parts are on different plants. But that's not the end of it. I've heard people say that Nisa sylvatica, the black gum, is dioecious. And that's not exactly true. It's polygamodioecious. And what that means is it has some trees that have mostly male flowers and some trees that have mostly female flowers, but they all have cosexual flowers. And the big point about the female flowers is that's where the fruit is made. So if you want berries on your holly, you have to have a female. With black gum, they all produce berries, although the ones that have female flowers and cosexual flowers produce a lot more. Maples are the opposite. They're polygamomonoecious, which means they have cosexual and male and female flowers all in the same plant. Actually, it's a longer word than that, because maples can have any combination of male flowers, female flowers, and cosexual flowers. I've seen maples that have male branches and female branches, and they get seeds on some of the branches and not others. I have an all-male red maple that doesn't get any seeds. Others get seeds everywhere, and the cool thing is they can change. Now, some of these plants are wind pollinated. These tend to be either monoecious or dioecious, in which case they make very small male flowers that hang out at the end of the branch, usually in something like a catkin, and usually very small female parts. The ones that are insect and bird pollinated tend to have large, showy flowers to attract those insects. Another issue, and this isn't brought up in the book, is self-incompatibility, because even in the plant kingdom, it's not a good idea to date yourself. So dioecy is a way of keeping plants from not self-pollinating, because the whole point of sex is to mix the genes, not keep making the same genes. Herkogamy is structural differences, dichogamy is temporal difference, and then there are a bunch of genetic things that can happen that can prevent pollen from the same tree from fertilizing eggs from the same tree. Here is an example of herkogamy. This is the rhododendrons. They all have these very long styles. And so the part that receives the pollen is way out here and the anthers are back here. So There are a lot of questions, it seems. Let's start. New message. Ginkgos are dioecious. So unlike conifers, which tend to be monoecious, although there are some conifers that are dioecious. And the reason that's important, and you want to make sure you're not getting a female tree, is those female structures smell, and so does the fruit. It's really messy. Pawpaw is not dioecious, it's monoecious. It's not polygamo-monoecious. It produces actually perfect flowers, but it exhibits dichogamy. So what happens is the pollen mature, or the ova, the eggs mature and are receptive to pollen for 1 week. And then the pollen matures a week later. But they are perfect flowers. They don't have male and female flowers. They are monoecious. It's just that they are set up so they can't receive their own pollen. That's why you need to have trees of different groups. Said there were 4 comments. In order to get fruit on those things. Okay, I think this is the last section before we take a break. Water and gas exchange. This can be kind of confusing, but it's really important. When human beings exchange gas with the environment, we do it using muscles that expand and contract our chest cavities. Unfortunately, trees don't have that. So they rely on a physics property called partial pressure differentials. So if we look at these 2 boxes, and these are 2 separate volumes of, say, air, and you can see that this volume has 9 red crosses and 3 blue stars, which makes it the partial pressure of the red crosses 75% and the partial pressure of the blue stars 25%. And in this one, it is reversed. If we open a pathway between these 2 that both the blue crosses and the red crosses and the blue stars can traverse, we will wind up with a balancing of the same number of stars and crosses in both of these volumes. This is what happens when the stomata opens and the leaf atmosphere has, the leaf atmosphere has a lot of oxygen in it, but very little carbon dioxide. And the outer atmosphere, relatively speaking, has a lot of carbon dioxide and very little oxygen. Oxygen moves out of the leaf and carbon dioxide moves in. So that's how gas exchange happens. Now, if you have a semi-permeable membrane that will only allow the stars to migrate, what will happen is, because you've got a lot more blue stars and fewer of these red crosses in this volume, the blue stars will migrate into the other volume. This is what happens with osmosis, although you don't necessarily have a semi-permeable membrane. But where you have fewer dissolved solids and lots of water molecules compared to lots of dissolved solids and fewer water molecules, osmotic pressure pushes the water molecules towards the less concentrated or the more concentrated solution. And that's how water gets into the root system. It's through these differences in partial pressures. This is controlled. I mentioned the stomata. This is the bottom of a willow oak leaf. All of those little white dots are stomata. Those are those little pores that open and close like change purses. And in the stem, we have lenticels. In the stomata, what's happening is oxygen and water vapor comes out, carbon dioxide goes in. In the lenticels, oxygen or carbon dioxide comes out and oxygen goes in, because that gas exchange is, the lenticels are supporting cellular respiration, where the stomata are supporting photosynthesis. When the tree is gathering water and nutrients, the effective area that the root will affect is called the rhizosphere. It's only about 5 millimeters from the edge of the root. That's a very short distance. So there is not a lot of soil column that this root is getting water and nutrients from. I mentioned the mycorrhizal fungi. Here is a picture. You can see this mycelial fan. This is the fungi reaching out into the soil column to extend the reach of the roots, to enable the root or enable the plant to get more water and nutrients. And notice it's also filling in these spaces between the roots. Another form of mutualism, this is a spruce seedling. You can see these little bumpy things in the root system. Those are actually rhizobium nodules. So rhizobium is a nitrogen fixing bacteria. It has mastered the trick of splitting nitrogen molecules into nitrogen atoms, which then can be used as a plant nutrient. And some plants like spruces and alders and legumes, the whole pea family, have adapted to support and protect those things. So that bacteria is getting sugar, the plant is getting nitrogen, the bacteria is also getting protection in the form of those root nodules. So, are there any questions on that? All right, we're going to take a break here. And then we'll come back in about 5 minutes. So that'll be, say, 8:25, and we'll pick up on some more information that will and eventually talk about pruning. And whoever's running this thing can probably stop the recording during the break, or you're going to have about 8 minutes of dead air.
Pause it. Lori? Lori?
Yep.
So if you left your speakers on, you can hear me saying you should come back and sit down and start listening again, because we still have quite a bit of material to cover, and we're probably going to be about 10 minutes over the 9 o'clock hour to cover it all. So one of the things we haven't really talked about is how trees grow and branches are attached to them. And that's really important if you're going to think about pruning. So we've said the primary growth starts, the shoots start, and then the secondary growth starts at the top and goes down to the bottom. What this means then is the branch gets a new layer of wood, and then the trunk gets a new layer, and that trunk growth attaches to and kind of wraps around the branch layer. And what we see then is kind of a weaving of the branch tissues with the trunk tissues. So we get this wood. And usually, so we get this very strong connection. And this usually takes place, is most prominent in something called the branch collar, and there's very strong wood in the branch collar that supports good branch attachment. So good branch attachment, you can see it here, kind of a U-shaped with this branch bark ridge. Bad branch attachment, you don't have those, and I'll show you a picture of that. So this is Alex Shigo, who really did a lot of work to expand our understanding of how trees work. This is a diagram that he drew. This is based on killing and cutting up a lot of trees with chainsaws. You can see even in this diagram, there's that branch bark ridge, which is an indicator of a good connection. This is a branch that ripped off of my willow oak, and I looked at it. You can see the trunk wood and how it's kind of wrapping around the branch wood here inside the tree. From the outside, we have good branch unions and we have bad branch unions. The picture on the right is a good union. You can see these, the branch bark ridge there, and that means that the wood under the bark is weaving together and it's being bound up right there at the union. On the left-hand side, this is a bad branch union. This is more of a V shape. There is no bark branch ridge here. In fact, you can see the bark goes down, and you can see this seam down through the tree, which is where the wood from this branch and this branch have not really connected and grafted to each other. This is a calorie pair. This is why they fall apart when they get older. Okay. Let's also talk, the other thing we need to understand is when trees grow and they get wounded, they don't grow new wood to replace the missing wood that goes away from decay or from the wound. What they do is they will compartmentalize that in a process we call CODIT, which stands for compartmentalization of decay in trees. So remember, only the meristem can make new cells. So when trees lose tissue, they do not replace them. What they will do, though, is seal off decaying wounds. And they do it, like I said, by building a compartment around the wood or the wounds. Some of these barriers get laid down during growth, and others are created in the heartwood. And in the sapwood, parenchyma can create and reinforce these barriers chemically, because in the sapwood, parenchyma, which is living, can produce these chemicals. So this is the standard diagram. There are 4 walls to this compartment. The top and the bottom wall are the same. They're called wall 1, and they are the weakest. This essentially is the process of clogging up the vascular tissue to prevent your decay organisms, whether they're fungi or bacteria, from using that vascular tissue to move up and down in the tree. Wall 2 is laid down during growth. This is the next weakest wall. I already mentioned this one. Remember, I said that at the end of the growing season, the tree will produce a thick layer of tougher cells, and that is wall 2 that is there to try and prevent decay from penetrating deeper into the tree. Wall 3 is also laid down at the time of when the tree grows, and that is those parenchymal rays that you saw. And they create barriers that keep decay from moving side to side in the tree. The 4th wall that you can't see in this diagram, and it doesn't exist until the tree suffers a penetrating wound, is the new growth over the wound. This is the strongest wall. There are only a few species of wood decay fungi that can actually penetrate this wall. And the function there is to keep the decay from penetrating into and infecting new tissues that the tree is growing. Eventually, what will happen is this wound wood, this is reaction wood from the cambium, will come together and it will seal off this wound. It will graft, and you'll get, this is not an accurate picture because you should be able to see those ram's horns curls still inside the tree where they haven't quite met yet. So here is this is a maple twig that got wounded, and basically all the walls failed because it doesn't look like it, but all you have here is new growth that occurred after the wound. You can see those ram's horns where the new growth is going to try and seal this off, but pretty much all of the wood that existed when the tree was wounded has disappeared, which means walls 1, 2, and 3, or at least 2 and 3 have failed. And you can see from this picture and the extent of the decay down into the unwounded part that wall 1 also failed. Maples are not really good at resisting decay. But as I said, what will happen is over time, those ram's horns will grow together, they'll graft together, and you'll start to get a continuous layer of wood around that wound. So this tree, if it survives these girdling roots down here, will eventually close up this hole completely, and the seam will disappear. And sometime in the distant future, somebody might cut this tree down and be surprised to find that the stem is hollow because it's not going to regrow the tissue that was lost to the decay. Tree growth and hormones, we're going to breeze through this because we already talked about it a little bit. In dicots, there are these suppressed buds. This is what they look like. Somebody in Alexandria took this picture and emailed it to me and said, "What's going on with this tree?" And those little bumps and pimples you see here are those suppressed buds that keep growing just a little bit every year to stay out near the edge of the wood. So if conditions become favorable, they can then sprout. These are release buds. This is an ash tree. This is a symptom of emerald ash borer attacks, where the ash borer kills the tree from the top down, and at some point it kills enough of the branches and disconnects enough of the terminal buds from the system that all of these sprouts get released, and you start getting all the sprouting along the trunk of the tree. This is a sign of disease. As I said, on some occasions, if for some reason this tree was in shade and now all of a sudden it has light, you might see this sprouting as well. And I mentioned the X current and D current depending on the apical dominance. This is what, excuse me, what an X current tree looks like. This is what most of your conifers grow like, but tulip poplar almost always grows this way. Sweet gum will grow this way, where it has a very defined central leader and a very defined trunk. A D current tree is one. Notice when it was young, it had strong apical dominance with a single trunk, but as it started to mature, apical dominance went out the window and you start getting a lot of branching. This is the way things like willow oaks grow. All right. Now I wanted to go through that because one of the things I was asked to talk about tonight is pruning. What we are going to talk about and what is presented in the text in the TreeSteward manual is pruning using the natural pruning method. There are some other pruning methods that I'll mention in a little bit. But before you start thinking about pruning, you need to understand, and this is really important, that pruning live tissue is wounding the tree. I'm going to say it again because, like I said, it's really important. Pruning live tissue is wounding the tree. When you prune live tissue, you are reducing the energy potential of the tree because you're cutting out branches that support leaves where photosynthesis takes place. At the same time, you open pathways for pathogens. You may change the odor and the color, at least in the ultraviolet, of the tree that will attract pests. And you will force the tree to start working on wound closure. All of those things potentially raise the energy outlay of the tree. So when you prune, you are reducing the energy potential. At the same time, you're causing the tree to expend more energy. This is like your bills going up when your income goes down. So when you think about pruning the tree, you need to make sure that pruning is going to improve things. And you need to keep in mind this balance between energy production and energy expenditures. The other thing to realize about pruning is that most of it is done before you even pick up a tool. You observe the plant, you see what's wrong, what possibly needs to be done. Then you set your objectives. This is what I want to accomplish on this pruning session. And you set your plan for how am I going to achieve those objectives? All at the same time, keeping in mind you are thinking about wounding this tree and you are thinking about changing its energy balance. It's only after you have gone through these thought processes that you even contemplate picking up your tool and making a cut. And there is a reason that in this diagram, the box that says make cuts is smaller than the others, because that is the least important part of pruning. It's all of this observation, setting objectives, and making plans. And I'll go through an example of some pruning that I've done in my yard and my thought processes. So why do we prune trees? Well, one of the best reasons to prune trees is to maintain their health. This is particularly important when you get woody fungal pathogens that attack the branches, things like black knot in cherries, attack the tips of the branches first. And so by pruning out that infected tissue, you can improve the health of the tree. You might also prune to reduce the risk of failure. This would mostly be things like poorly attached branches. And the thing to keep in mind is, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, pruning is not just about removing branches. It can also be about shortening branches, but there are other tools besides pruning that can address risk. Most of those involve getting an arborist who's been trained involved to climb the tree. But it's not only pruning. The saw is not your only tool for reducing risk. We also will prune to provide clearance for pedestrians, for vehicles, to get trees from scraping against the house and keep trees from growing into power lines. A lot of that can be taken care of when the tree is planted by putting the right tree in the right place. Then you don't have to prune for clearance. If you are working in an orchard, you may be pruning to influence flower and fruit production. Some people will prune to reduce shade. The whole point of having a tree, in my book, is to have shade. The solution is not to prune the tree, it's to grow something that will grow in the shade. But you can prune to reduce shade. You can also prune to reduce wind resistance. This has been called into question because the science is very particular, and what we have found is if you do this wrong, you can actually increase wind resistance by pruning. Then there are people who prune trees to improve their view or improve aesthetics. This usually involves topiary or something like that. A lot of the problems, though, that we prune for can be fixed simply by planting the right tree in the right place. And I know you may have inherited this tree that was planted in the wrong place by somebody else, so you need to do these things. So we talked about growth, and we mentioned the hormones. Trees did evolve to lose branches due to forest shading. So they have a built-in evolutionary mechanism to deal with losing branches. And this is mainly at the branch collar. As I said, in branch attachment, the branch collar is really important because that's where the branch wood and the trunk wood kind of interweave together to form a strong union. But at the branch collar, you also find something that's called the branch protection zone. And this is where the meristem is primed to create that reaction wood to seal off that wound. And the tree is creating and storing biocides to control decay coming in through the branch. Remember the hormones and the terminal buds and those suppressed lateral buds. When we prune, we need to be mindful of this. We don't want to release those suppressed buds. Or maybe we do want to release those suppressed buds, especially when we are pruning shrubs or we're pruning mature trees that have started to go into retrenchment. We may want to release some of those buds to get some more branches up into the crown. The other thing you need to know is that when you shorten a branch, you are reducing its energy production and you are slowing down its growth relative to the rest of the tree. In a natural pruning system, all pruning is done at branch unions. There are some other specialized pruning systems like pollarding or coppicing, or I've mentioned topiary and hedging, where you may not be making your cuts at branch unions. But in the natural pruning system, which is what you're learning tonight, all of that pruning is done at the branch union. So here is what I was talking about in that last slide. Trees lose branches, and this is pictured this. You see this all the time in the woods where you have a dead stub sticking away from the trunk of the tree, and the tree is trying to use its wound wood or its reaction wood to pinch off that dead stub. Here's the branch collar. You can see there's been a lot of decay in this dead branch, and the last thing the tree wants is for that decay, because remember, a well-attached branch goes all the way into the center of the tree. The tree would prefer, or the tree shouldn't allow decay to go down through that branch into the center of the tree where it can get into the heartwood of the tree. So it is primed to do that. And when we do good pruning, we are working with this system that the tree already has in place. Some trees are better at self-pruning than others. Tulip poplars are really good at it. Once they get to be anywhere, once the bark starts to roughen up and they start to get to be about 8 to say 15 inches in diameter, you'll see these eyes on it. This is where there was a branch, and this circular thing is the old branch, and this is the bark branch ridge. And together they form this thing that looks like an eye. So before we get into cuts, there is a question. Casey Trees today posted an article on why shaded areas have less crime than unshaded communities. The basic understanding of that is well cared for trees are an indication that people are paying attention. And in crime, that means witnesses, which are bad for your business if you're a criminal. Okay. So as I mentioned, in the natural pruning system, we do all of our cuts at the branch union, and there are only two types of cuts we make. One is a removal cut. The other is a reduction cut. A removal cut, I think the text uses the term branch removal cut. Seems a little bit long-winded, but you can see this dotted line here. This comes from the ISA. This is where we are removing the smaller piece from the larger piece at the branch union. So we are cutting off this smaller branch from either the trunk or from a larger branch. Now, in the book, it teaches you to make what I call the Shigo cut. You visualize a line from the bark branch ridge that is perpendicular to the growth axis of the branch you're going to remove, and then you make your cut bisecting the bark branch ridge and that visualized line. So it looks something like this. There is a problem we have noticed. A lot of these Shigo cuts, and I call it Shigo because it was Alex Shigo who came up with this, you see this kind of thing happening where you've got this little stub that is sticking out past the area where the tree is trying to grow or is trying to seal off that pruning wound. And that means that it has to grow a lot more tissue to cover this thing up. And so what happens is that you can see in this picture on the right, there were some German researchers who looked at this and they saw a lot of this and they started doing stuff like this. And what they realized is that Shigo cut is actually leaving behind part of the branch that dies. And so what they have recommended is rather than do all that, visualize the line and bisect the angle, you simply go to the edge of the branch bark ridge and you cut straight down parallel to the growth axis of the larger piece. Now notice, this is not a flush cut, which would start up here and make a great big wound. You're cutting off the branch outside of the branch bark ridge. And when you do that, you're usually getting all of the part that dies. And so you have a much cleaner area for it to cover over. The other type of cut is a reduction cut. Ignore this. That's from the Master Gardener class, and that's page 63 of the Master Gardener text, not the TreeSteward text. At least I don't think so. But a reduction cut is where at the branch union, instead of cutting off the smaller piece, you're cutting off the larger piece. And so you can see here, this is why we call it a reduction cut. You've got a long branch and we're shortening that branch to this lateral branch. Now it's important that you make this cut properly so that the terminal bud here of this lateral branch can take over and keep any of those latent buds along this branch suppressed. And if you do this the proper way, that's what will happen. So here is how you make a reduction cut. It's very similar to the Shigo removal cut. You visualize the line that is perpendicular to the axis of growth, bisect the angle between the branch bark ridge and that visualized line, and make your cut here. So it's kind of a diagonal cut. And what that then does is it allows the branch bark ridge here to help control this wound closure, but also allows the terminal bud of this branch to continue to suppress the buds below the cut. So here's an example, my red maple in 2008. I was going to teach a pruning class, and I also had some issues. This branch was growing down and into my driveway and interfering with my car. I made this reduction cut. You can see here's the lateral branch, and here is the main branch that I reduced. I made the cut in 2008. This is what it looked like in 2009. 2.5 years later, in 2011, you can see it's getting good wound closure. You're not seeing much in the way of decay here, but notice also that there is no sprouting around this wound. In 2022, the wound is almost closed, still no sprouting here. So the terminal bud of this lateral is suppressing the rest of the buds on this branch. When we are thinking about this and making our plans, there's what I call the 1/3 watch out situation. I call it a watch out situation because it's not that you should not do it. It just means you should be really careful if you violate it. So 1/3 refers to the ratio of the two parts at the branch union, the smaller part to the larger part. And as I said, watch out means be careful, not that you shouldn't do it. It used to be that this was a rule and you should never violate this, but in more recent professional standards, it's become they don't use watch out. That's something I picked up from fire, but you should use your judgment and be aware that at 1/3 you can start running into problems. So when you're doing a branch removal, the watch out is when you're removing a branch that's more than 1/3 the diameter of the larger part. Once it's below 1/3, there's usually no problem. Between 1/3 and 1/2, you might run into some issues with decay in the part that you're removing the branch from. Once you get above 1/2, the likelihood of decay in the branch that you're removing from goes up a lot. And at that point, you might start thinking about doing a reduction on the branch rather than a removal. And I will talk about that in a minute and give you some good pictures. When you are reducing, the 1/3 is the minimum. So you want the lateral branch, ideally the lateral branch will be more than 1/3 the diameter of the part that you're removing. Doesn't have to be, but when you start going below 1/3, you can run into some problems with wound closure and with sprouting. So once you approach this, whether you're doing a reduction or a removal, this is where you want to maybe think it over again, maybe consider some other alternatives. Like I said, it's a watch out. This is a place where there can be problems. Another thing, and I don't think they talk about this in the book directly, is the shear plane. When branches are being held out away from the trunk of the tree, the lower part of the branch is in compression and the upper part is in tension. So the wood fiber and in the top of the branch is being stretched, the wood fiber in the bottom is being compressed. And in between, where tension becomes compression, is something called the shear plane. And this is where the wood can separate and not be as well connected as it might. If you put too much weight on the end of the branch, you can get a shear plane crack. This is what happened to my maple back a couple of years ago. We had about 6 or 8 inches of snow, and there was virtually no wind, and it was piling up like that on the twigs. And it just put so much weight on that branch that the wood separated along that shear plane. If you're not aware of this, if you don't pay attention, you can wind up with pruning wounds that look like this. This is where the shear plane cracked, where the branch cracked along the shear plane and tore down into the trunk of the tree. So to prevent that, when you're doing a removal cut, you use the 3-cut method. The first cut goes up into the branch, well away, a few inches beyond the where you're going to make your final cut. The purpose of that first cut is to cut through that compression wood, ideally about halfway through the diameter up into that shear plane. So if, as you cut the tension wood, when you're making this second cut, it causes a crack along the shear plane, it'll stop where that first cut was made. And that second cut goes all the way through. And what that's doing is removing all that weight of the limb. Then you're left with this little stub, and you make your final cut that as we just talked about, to remove that stub. And that will not branch, that won't damage the branch color. It won't tear into the trunk of the tree and create a bigger wound. The other thing you should be aware of is proper pruning cuts do not need to be sealed or dressed, especially sealed. In some cases, you might apply a fungicide to the wound if you have to make a cut when there are known fungal pathogens of that species. For example, Dutch elm disease, or if you're in the Midwest or in Pennsylvania, oat wilt. You might use that. But there we're talking about a product like Lysol, not the stuff that is sold as wound sealant. You don't want to use that. That just gets in the way of the coated response and the natural process of dealing with that wound. Since there are no questions in the chat box, I'm going to press on. So here's a couple of examples of pruning young trees, of pruning a young tree. Back in October of 2008, I was teaching my first pruning class. And I thought, it'd be good if I have some examples, some pictures to show them. So I went out and I looked. This is my crabapple that had been in the ground about 3 years. So it was well established. It was time to start thinking about pruning. And when I evaluated it, when I observed it, I noticed that it had a codominant leader. And it also had this very large, vigorously growing lower branch, which was ideal because those are two of the things you talk about when pruning young trees. So I had to decide how I was going to deal with these two things. Now, this was still a fairly young tree, and this was a long branch that had made up a lot of the canopy. It was a pretty large percent of the canopy. And I didn't want to deprive the tree completely of all of the energy that branch was producing. So rather than remove it, I decided to do a reduction cut. And what I did was I followed the branch up. I found a nice lateral here. This is visualizing that line that's perpendicular to the growth axis of the branch. And then notice I rotated down. Here I've got overhand grip. This is more of a handshake grip. And I made my cut, which looked like this when I got done. So what was the effect of making that one cut on that branch, doing that one reduction cut? Well, this is the way things looked in 2008. This branch is a little over, maybe 1/3, maybe a little more than 1/3 the diameter of the trunk. So removing it would have been slightly problematic. It also would have removed a lot of leaf area from the tree. 2.5 years later, in 2011, this is what happened. So making that reduction cut slowed this branch's growth relative to the trunk, the central leader of the tree. And at this point, this branch is less than 1/3 the diameter of this branch. I could have removed it, but it was growing nicely, and I have let it remain as a scaffold branch. This is what it looked like in 2016. Significant difference in diameter. And this is the result of making that one cut in 2008. This is why I would caution you to think it through. What are my options? And keep in mind that pruning is not necessarily something that is done only once. It's something that is an ongoing process. I keep going back to this tree and reevaluating it and pruning it. This is the pruning wound. This is what it looked like when I made the cut. This is what it looked like 2.5 years later. I can't find it anymore after this picture in 2011. The second problem was this vigorously growing lower branch. Again, I didn't want to lose this. And when you're pruning young trees, that's one of the things you need to think about is you want to control the growth of these branches, recognizing that it's very likely that sometime in the future you're going to remove them. So you want to keep them small relative to the trunk. So I did a reduction cut out here. Had I known then what I know now, I might have used this as my lateral because the lateral I chose was still growing out into the street. Again, this is what the situation was in 2008. This is what it looked like 2.5 years later. At this time, I was able to very safely remove this branch from the trunk of the tree, preserving the branch collar. And I have had no problems with the wound here. Very quickly, we're going to talk a little bit about root pruning. Root pruning is a little bit different because trees are not evolved to lose roots. They're evolved to lose branches, but not roots. You need to keep in mind the dendritic pattern of root growth, at least on everything but palms. So large roots connect to large sections of the root system. If you cut a large root, you're going to be removing a large portion of the root system. Those absorbing roots that bring in the water and nutrients are being shed and regrown constantly. Trees shed about the same mass of absorbing roots every year as they do leaves. And for younger trees, it may be even a greater mass than the amount of leaves they're losing. When roots are less than about 1 inch in diameter, that is less than about the size, well, at least of my thumb, they will sprout and grow and seal rapidly. So cutting roots that are less than 1 inch in diameter is not a problem. The tree will recover from that very quickly. When you are root pruning, if you are not exposing the root before you cut it and you're cutting into soil, that's going to dull your tools very quickly. So you want to either use tools that you can afford to get dull, or you want to expose those roots and make sure you're only cutting the roots and not cutting soil. The most common application of root pruning that you're going to run into is when you are planting container stock. It is not infrequent that you will pull a plant out of a container and you'll get a root ball that looks like this. You can see there are connective roots that are already growing in the wrong direction. There were some circling roots on the other side. This thing was a mess. My initial idea was to bare root this tree, but the root ball was so dense, there were so many roots in it, I could not get any of the soil of the growing medium out of it. Now, I just saw an episode this weekend of Ask This Old House, and they were planting some trees that looked like this, and the horticulturist was taking her gardening knife and making these vertical slits in here. University research shows that doesn't do any good. The other thing that people will do with a root ball like this is they'll try to butterfly it. So they'll grab hold of the bottom and they'll try to rip it up and flatten it out. That does not do any good. What does work is what we call squaring the ball. And this horrifies people because you're losing all of these roots. And like I said, these are those fine absorbing roots that, or roots less than 1 inch in diameter. So the plant covers really quickly from this. And squaring the ball is taking a saw or a sharp shovel. Some people say you plant the root ball first and then take the shovel and you do this. Other people say you cut it first. I am a fan. I prefer to cut it first. It's easier to do. My shovel isn't that sharp, but you just slice off the outer edges of the root ball all the way around, and it may include slicing the bottom edge, and then you plant this the way you normally would. Now, one thing to keep in mind is a root ball like this has lots and lots of absorbing roots, so it will dry out very quickly, and you need to give it a lot more water than you would an established planting. I'm going to close very quickly talking about pruning tools. These are your basic tools: a pair of shears and a handsaw. Handsaws can be folding. If they are folding, make sure they have a lock, and make sure that it locks anytime you go to use it, because you do not want that thing to fold up while you have a grip on the handle. The backs of your fingers are not going to be happy if you do that. For larger stems, you might use loppers. They come in a lot of different shapes, but some of them have these ratchets that give you additional closing power. One of the things, though, is you don't want to try and cut something that does not comfortably fit within the jaws of your lopper. If it doesn't, you need to go to a saw. As I showed you, bow saw. The nice thing about bow saws is the blades are easy to replace and they're fairly cheap. They also tend to cut faster. So I use this on bigger diameter things. I also used it in that root pruning because this is now my root ball blade. I've got a new blade for cutting wood with. You might, for taller things, get a pole saw or a pole lopper. This one combines both. Notice that it has the spring-loaded thing, pull down, and it cuts through it. When you are buying loppers or hand pruners or pole pruners, you want to get bypass shears. This has two cutting blades that go past each other and cut both from the bottom and the top. Anvil pruners, on the other hand, only have a single blade, and they tend to crush the tissue below here. This is not considered a good tool. I'm surprised that companies like Fiskars, and I don't think Felco even makes anvil shears. If you get into some of those other pruning systems like hedges and topiary, you might get hedge clippers. We got hedge clippers that had the mountain mint. You want to keep your tools clean and sharp. The shear blades can be sharpened by you with a stone or a file. The saw blades are a little bit different, and usually you wind up replacing them. You should clean your tools after every use. You want to remove any plant juices, oils, or acids or things that could start pitting and rusting your blades. You should disinfect with a 10% bleach solution and then wipe it down with either wipe it with an oilcloth or hit it with some WD-40. Oil your pivot points, keep your wooden handles in good shape, and keep those branches close to the pivot point when you use your loppers. When you are pruning diseased plants, always disinfect your blades between cuts. If you don't, you might spread the disease from one part of the plant to another part of the plant, or from one plant to another. And that is all I have for you tonight. We're only 10 minutes late. I'm sorry about that, but you guys asked a bunch of good questions. Do I have any recommendations for particular styles or brands of clippers? As I said, you want bypass clippers. Generally, it is considered that Felco makes the best pruning tools. Fiskars is a good second. The best seasons to prune. So that really depends on how much you are going to prune. You can prune pretty much any time of the year if you're doing light pruning. If you're going to do some heavy pruning, it's usually best to do that during the dormant season, depending on what you are trying to do. Because for some conifers, if you prune during the dormant season, they tend to grow even more once the growing season occurs. So you might want to, so those usually prune late in the growing season. For certain types of trees, like maples and birches particularly, you can prune them any time of the year, but for professionals, they usually don't like to prune them in the spring. And that's because they're what we call bleeders. So they'll put out a lot, so that pruning wound will bleed. It'll put out a lot of sap. And the client looks at that, thinks, oh my God, he's killed my tree. And they go, no, it really doesn't. And it really doesn't hurt the tree, but it doesn't look good. So there are aesthetic reasons for not doing that. But there is a pruning calendar that was put together by Virginia Cooperative Extension. It's a little bit out of date. One of the authors died 10 years ago. The other one left Extension more than 17 years ago. But it does offer some guidance on when to prune. I have an oak near me that got struck by lightning, which blew off some of the bark from the trunk. Will the tree be able to repair this? Yes. I see that frequently out in the woods where there are lightning struck trees that are getting better. A lot of that, a lot of whether or not the tree will be able to survive will depend on how healthy it is now and how well it's taken care of. But certainly it has the potential to fix that. Remember that one tree that I showed you that had the big long seam in it? That may have been lightning damage that it was closing up. So yeah, they can survive lightning strikes, especially ones that blow the bark off the tree. I have seen some lightning strikes. I don't think the trees can survive, but that's where the lightning goes down through the pith of the tree and it essentially blows out wood fiber. It looks like there are a whole bunch of toothpicks stuck on opposite sides of the tree, all the way up and down. And essentially what's happened is the lightning has split that tree in two as it stood there. I suppose it could survive that, but the other issue is there's a lot of tissue damage because the lightning is very hot and it'll boil out a lot of the water and sap and stuff in the tree. So, are there any other questions? I'm going to stop sharing and we can go to more of a verbal thing where you get to talk and I get to answer. As soon as I do this. Any more questions? All right, then I'm going to turn it back.
No.
Alexandria.
Sir, we have an old oak tree, northern red. We were building a deck that was very close to a deck that we were building, and we had to cut a major root. I worry now that we may have damaged it beyond it. Yeah, it really hurt it. Anything we can do to help keep its life going.
Yeah, and you say you cut a major root. How far away from the trunk of the tree was it?
2 feet, maybe 1 foot, 2 feet.
All right, that significantly lowers the prognosis because essentially you cut some of those buttress roots. So in addition to the tree living, you have also destabilized that tree. And there is a section in the TreeSteward's manual on construction damage. And so cutting that close to the trunk of the tree, you have significantly reduced its root support. I'm not going to say it's It's going to die because trees love to make arborists look stupid. But the best thing you can give that tree is palliative care. You probably want to work with a certified arborist on this, but you yourself, one of the things that really stresses trees in suburban areas is turf. So pulling the turf as far away from that tree as you can stand it. I have pulled the turf all the way to my property lines. I don't have any turf grass. But as far as you can stand it, and give it a good mulch bed, and that mulch can be either brown mulch in the form of wood chips, or it could be green mulch in the form of ground covers, native wildflowers and things that like shade. That would be the best thing that you personally can do. There are some other things that can be done that require a lot more money, a lot more time, a lot more energy, and are going to require you using a certified arborist, probably one of the bigger companies, because what they're going to recommend is you do a soil test, but you also want to include a penetrometer to see how compacted the soil is around in the root zone of that tree. And you may need to do something to decompact it, which usually means bringing in an air spade, which is loud and expensive, but can do a very good job of fluffing up that soil and mixing in some organic matter to improve that. Some of the tree growth hormones can also increase root growth, fine absorbing root growth, closer in on those bigger roots. But my bigger concern is that you have cut a lot of the structural support out of that tree by cutting that root.
Thank you. I'm afraid of that too. I will say that we don't have any turf in our whole yard. We got rid of grass years ago.
Okay, so your tree is probably pretty happy on that account. That's all I can suggest. Bring in an arborist, talk to him about your soils and what you can do to improve the soils.
Thank you.
Okay, Scott, it looks like you've got your hand up.
Yes. First off, I just want to say this is an excellent lecture. I learned a lot. I'm always amazed by how much I think I know that I didn't really know correctly, and you've helped me tonight. But one thing I like to do when I'm talking to a really knowledgeable person is check some of my, as a tree steward, I use a lot of rules of thumb. And when people ask me for advice, I use rules of thumb. Like the 1-to-3 ratio for branch prunings and things like that. But one of my rules of thumb is that when something happens to the root system of a tree, like construction damage or soil compression from all the bulldozers when you put an extension on your house, I tend to tell people that if you go beyond affecting a third of the root system of a tree, the tree tends to decline. Is that about right? As a rule of thumb?
Yeah, that's about right. Usually we talk in terms of the critical root zone of a tree.
Yes.
Which is not the entire root zone. So like I said, a lot of those roots out there way out at the periphery are those kind of fine absorbing roots, and losing those really doesn't affect the tree too much because it regrows them very quickly. The critical root zone, unfortunately, it's a concept, but we haven't really operationalized it very well. So you'll talk to some people that say the critical root zone is the drip line or 1 foot outside the drip line. Other people use the formula of 1 foot radius per inch diameter at breast height. Some people use 1.5 foot radius per inch diameter at breast height. And in general, if you do not compromise more than about a third, most of the regulations I've seen puts it up to 40% of that critical root zone, the tree has a significant chance of survival.
Right.
But you are likely to have some decline associated with it, because you are going to it is going to stress the tree more
right,
than
right.
if
And
you don't do
you
it.
sometimes have crown dieback, which can then cause more root dieback, and then you have a vicious cycle and the tree declines.
Yeah.
But I'm usually giving this advice to homeowners when they do something like they install an irrigation system for their turf again, and they cut off they cut
Yeah.
way under the into under the they're way between they're between the drip line and the trunk, and they're actually closer to the trunk. I explained that the root zone
Yep.
generally
You're doing it right.
is 3 times the drip line, and so there's a lot of roots. And when you cut that close to the tree, you're losing all those roots. And if you get more than a third, the tree's going to decline.
Yep. That's a good way to put it. That's where you say, well, you might start thinking about directional boring, or maybe rewriting that line instead of going straight across the tree,
Right.
go around the tree.
Right. And if they've already done it, or they've already had a bulldozer parked under their tree, then I suggest that they talk to a professional arborist, or even consider the fact that they may need to replace the tree. And I tend to advise people to plant a small tree in advance of taking out the larger tree, and
Yep.
watch the larger tree. And if it declines, then take it out.
Yep.
So.
That's a good advice. It's always hard to talk to somebody after they've done something really bad to their tree.
Right. Right.
It's
Especially
not
if
like
they
a
love the
haircut.
tree.
It's not going to grow back.
Right.
My neighbors had their tree lion-tailed, and my wife said, you can go over there and tell them what they did. And I said, yeah, I'm just going to make them feel bad. I mean, it's not like you can fix it.
Right.
So
Thank you, Jim.
let's see. I see a couple of things in the chat. Great class. And anything to do to help okay, we already covered that. Any other questions before I turn it over to Noreen and I guess it's Lori that are running this show? All right. Back to you, Noreen.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'll turn it back over to Lori. She's the master of ceremonies. But thank you very much. It was a great class.
You're welcome. And I'll hang around till you're ready to shut down.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jim. So if no one else has any more questions, we will stop the recording. Any more questions? Going once, going twice? All right. Thank you again very much, Jim. We
Okay.
are off the hook.
I will be back in a few weeks to talk about